Joe Coburn now on BBC Two covers the latest political developments.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the SNP MP Kenny MacAskill, Conservative MP Simon Clarke, The Guardian's Polly Toynbee and Professor Emeritus of French History at Cambridge University, Robert Toombs. Today, scientists sound the alarm over the South Africa variant of coronavirus spreading in the UK.
If somebody has been infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and become unwell with COVID-19, the disease, in the past, it might be potentially, if they come into contact with this variant, they may become unwell again.
Door-to-door testing is underway in parts of England, but should all international arrivals be made to quarantine in hotels?
We will continually evolve our strategies, but that is actually unfeasible.
A comprehensive quarantine would significantly reduce the risk of mutations reaching this country.
And as one of Nicola Sturgeon's fiercest critics from the SNP's front bench, the party's justice spokesperson slams the move as inexplicable and harmful to our cause. He joins us live. Well, let's start with that growing concern around the South Africa variant by showing you how a couple of the papers are covering it in their headlines. The race to trace mutant strain. And this is how The Guardian writes it up on their front page. Similarly concerned about the spread of the variant, which we are going to be talking about with our guests. I don't think we can... so we'll go to our panellists and say, are we being tough enough on the South African variant? Simon.
Yes, we are taking this extremely seriously, and it's important, obviously, that the public does too. We've an enhanced testing programme in the 8 postcode areas where this has been detected, and we're encouraging everyone there to get a test, whether they have symptoms or not. And that's a reflection of the fact this is clearly a very serious development. However, it is absolutely the case that our border security is very, very rigorous, and no one now should be travelling without a good reason. We've instigated a requirement to quarantine for everyone returning to the United Kingdom. That is to say, there aren't laws anymore. And for 33 red list countries, we've banned all non-UK nationals from travelling to the UK at all.
Okay. And
UK nationals returning from there will have to go into hotel quarantine as soon as that's established, and active work is underway as we speak to get that package in place.
All right, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the quarantines. But Polly, is it tough enough, the policy at the moment and the government's response?
Well, the whole history has been too little, too late. And not getting ahead of the virus. It does look as if this new initiative to go knocking on people's doors, giving them all tests, making it easy to have tests, even people who've got no symptoms, because after all, a third of people with the virus don't have any symptoms, is a very good thing. But shutting the border ages ago, it was everybody's strongest instinct and said so, nor has there been much rebuke of, all sorts of well-known people who've been off on holidays over Christmas abroad, and somehow the government has not got ahead of that and said do that, or rebuking people who do. And certainly putting people into hotels does seem to be what's worked in New Zealand, in Australia, in other countries. And we could and should do it.
All right, I'm going to come back to you, Simon, in just a moment. I just want to get round the other guests. Kenny, I think I wrongly said that you were the justice spokesperson. You are no longer. But what's your response in terms of the government's response on being tough enough with this variant?
Well, I think I would echo Polly Toynbee's comments. I think it is belated. We did see criticism even from Priti Patel, who had cause for the borders being closed. I think we're heading in the right direction because this is situation critical. This is an extremely worrying variant, and therefore action has to be taken at the highest level. I do think quarantine has to be brought in. It's not just the countries that were mentioned earlier. South Asia and even Iceland have been doing this for some considerable time and have had far greater success. So we're heading in the right. It is tough. It might have to get tougher, but it's certainly got to be done.
Robert, what's your view?
Well, I'm just wondering how far you can go towards locking down a whole economy. We haven't really found that out yet. You know, in the past, when there were crises like this, you'd have had people starving in the streets. Thank God we're not anywhere near that. But can we actually close everything down? And if we do, what happens? How long can we keep it up? So I think the government's doing what it thinks is necessary, but it probably can't keep this virus, well, it obviously can't keep this virus out, and we've got to find some way of living with it.
All right, well, on the question of whether the government's response has been enough thus far, let's have a listen to the university's minister, Michelle Donnellan.
The message is, first of all, one about reinforcing the importance of the message that all of us and the restrictions that all of us should be abiding by. And secondly, I think it is about people thinking twice about their actions and their activities, having that conversation with their employer about making sure that they can work from home, etc., and just limiting even more the time that they are outside of their house.
Michelle Donnellan there. Let's talk to British immunologist Professor Daniel Altman. Daniel, is the government being tough enough in its response to try and contain and suppress this South African variant?
Well, I think the point I'd make is that this is such a serious step up in the virus's battle against us that we have to take it unbelievably seriously. We've been so strong in some parts of the response, our immunology and vaccinology and genomics, and rather less good perhaps at things like quarantining and track and trace. And this time we so have to get it right because it's here already and it spreads like wildfire.
Right. And what is it that worries you most? You say it spreads like wildfire. We know the transmissibility is much higher than other variants. Is there anything else that worries you about it?
Yeah, so when I sit and look at, so if you can see my desk, you'd see a sort of mess of lists of all these different mutations and what they do and where they are. And, we're all studying these things as hard as we can go. So there are these transmission, like the Kent one that we knew about.
Yes.
We had the sort of double whammy of caring about the ones that evade immunity in the South African one. And it now looks like we've got both of those here, both in imported varieties and homegrown varieties. So, that would make it so much harder to get out of this mess and get it under control.
Right. And the Kent mutation then has mutated further already, has it?
Yeah. So we're switching from it being just better at transmission to being better at transmission and better at avoiding immunity. So, you can only picture what that means for how hard it's going to be to get out of this.
Would you advise the government then at this stage to take further steps in terms of the postcodes that have been identified where they found cases of these other variants? Should people basically be asked to stay at home in pretty well all circumstances?
Well, I think that's a policy decision that's way above my pay grade. But I do think that for all our gaps in our track and trace up to now, at this stage, we really, really need to be one of the countries that are doing the job at the highest possible level, and trying to cut down spread of this new variant, because this could really make it very hard for us.
And the door-to-door testing, would that be enough to do what you are outlining?
Done really well and meaning it, yes.
Right. Tell us again, explain a bit more about this Kent variant mutating, because we're really only just hearing about this now. How is that happening?
Yeah, so do you remember at the beginning people like me were saying, we don't need to worry too much about mutations because it's quite a sluggish virus and it's not changing very, very fast. And now we're at a stage where, a year into it, they are a lot of different mutations coming up around the world. And it actually looks like the same ones coming up all over the planet. So this seems to be a kind of, if you like, a last-ditch effort on the part of the virus to find weak points. So one weak point is the ability to bind this ACE2, the receptor, and get into your cells and infect more people. And the other is the ability to avoid the antibodies that are trying to block its binding. So both of those things are happening at the moment. And now we've got both of them in this new modification of the Kent virus.
Right. And the vaccine, how much and how fast can we expect that to be a major part of suppressing further mutations or dealing with them? Professor Altman, can you hear me? We just got a slight glitch on the line, Professor Altman. Perhaps you could just start again.
Am I back? Yeah, so the vaccines are absolutely our plan A. So they still work against the variants, perhaps somewhat less well against this new one that we're talking about at the moment. But if enough people have the vaccine, they can still get us there.
Right. Thank you very much for joining us. Simon, why aren't we just implementing this hotel quarantine policy right now?
Well, there are a variety of important reasons around this. Partly the logistical challenge of getting hotel quarantine set up and the priorities we do so for those red list countries that I mentioned earlier. But it's also because there are genuinely important reasons why we do need to keep a certain amount of open travel allowed. Now, passenger numbers are down by well over 90%, which is fantastic. And obviously no one should be travelling without good reason, and the police are now enforcing that. But there are serious parts of our food chain, our PPE supply, our medicine supply, as well as returning UK nationals that we have to consider when making policy in this space. I would emphasise everyone returning is having to quarantine, everyone returning is having to fill out a passenger locator form, everyone returning is subject to spot checks by PHE and UK Border Force, and 3 million of those spot checks have been conducted to date, and you can face a fine of up to £10,000 if you're not self-isolating when required to. We are taking this deadly seriously, and it is important, obviously, the public do too.
Right.
We're not shying away from this because of any lack of willingness to act. There are very serious structural reasons why we do need to keep a certain amount of free travel open to us.
All right, well, we'll ask the others if they agree. But first of all, we're expecting Nicola Sturgeon to say something on this issue. Kenny, what can we expect?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Obviously, external UK borders are basically the responsibility of Westminster. So I welcome what Simon's saying, and going back, I think we've welcome the progress that's been made. I still think there's further to be going, but these actions are to be welcomed. But actions in UK borders are reserved to Westminster, other than public health actions that can be taken at airports for Auckland. So this is something where Holyrood and Westminster have to work together. I do think that it should have been brought in before. I do welcome what's now brought in, and I do, though, think that we'll probably have to go further.
Right. I mean, Danny, if you're still there, just listening to the two politicians, are taking it seriously enough.
I think they probably are, but you can probably hear from my voice that there's a certain level of anxiety that we can't hit this variant hard enough, and we really do need to take it very, very seriously. This isn't about trying to balance the virus against the economy. This is trying to kind of beat the virus before it's too late.
Danny, thank you very much for joining us. Robert, listening to that, does that change your initial thoughts at all?
Well, I suppose it does in a way. If medical experts are saying that this variant is suddenly dangerous and particularly new, then I suppose we have to be willing to do everything we can to stop it, at least in the short term. I mean, I think what worries all of us, is what the long-term damage is going to be, both to people's lives, to their livelihoods, and economic and social.
Polly?
It's been a problem all along that on the right of the Conservative Party, or the Conservative Party in general, has said we're much more concerned about the economy, and they've made a lot of fuss about that. A strong body of MPs. The point is there is no difference between the economy and beating the virus. You can't do one without the other. Until we beat the virus, we won't get the economy going. And it's a kind of madness to say it's one or...
Well, Simon, you've been shaking your head, and I'm going to get you to respond. But just before you do, I'll show everybody this headline in The Times, feeding into perhaps what Polly has been saying, which is SAGE, the advisory group to the government, warned number 10 over mutant virus, I should say, weeks ago.
Well, let me just take Polly's point on this first. There's not one of my colleagues who's saying the economy matters more than human life. There is, of course, I think any adult conversation, and Polly knows this to be true really, needs to reflect the full balance of all the things that we're trying to work to social and health and mental health issues that come with imposing the kind of restrictions we've had to do, and that's what my colleagues are talking about. It's a gross caricature to suggest otherwise.
Right, but there has been a split, hasn't there? There's been a split in cabinet. It's not as if everybody has agreed with the line that is now the current government policy, because we know from reports that Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, would have liked the borders to be sealed more firmly and more people to be sent to hotels to quarantine, and Matt Hancock the same. So there has been a disagreement, hasn't there, over this?
There'll always be, I'm sure, robust discussions about what the best interventions that we can make are. And of course, as I say, we have got a very robust package in place to make sure that no one is just mixing freely in society after returning from abroad. And indeed, no one ought to be going abroad at all without good reason. On the SAGE advice, look, ministers receive this and it's moving very quickly. And of course, our response is having to move very quickly as well. We're hearing now about these changes to the Kent strain and obviously the interaction with the South Africa strain. It is a extremely challenging situation for the government. We're doing our level best to make sure here that we come down on these new variants with the utmost severity as quickly as possible, and that is what we are seeing with the new postcode-based measures.
Do you accept that? I mean, the government rejects that they were told categorically what's been reported in the papers about the SAGE advice.
Well, they've been told time and time again by SAGE, you know, a circuit breaker, a quicker lockdown, don't do that over Christmas. And every time they've taken the advice far too late, if at all. And perhaps they're learning the lesson at last to follow the science as best we can.
All right, well, let's have a look at the progress on vaccination, because it certainly has gone apace in terms of vaccinations in England. I just want to show you the figures across the UK. Vaccine progress, percentage age 16 plus given first dose. That's from the 31st of January. England is 17.8%, Wales 16.1%, Northern Ireland 14.8%, and Scotland is at 12.7%. Why are they lagging behind, Kenny?
I don't know. I think there's an issue there to be addressed. I think, first of all, we're going to say this isn't a rerun of the annual Scotland-England football match. This is about both jurisdictions trying to ensure the welfare and safety of their citizens. I do think we have to go on and have to be considerations. Obviously, in Scotland, primacy is being dealt with by the health boards, whereas in England, GPs are going directly. Now, if the health boards are proving an impediment as opposed to the method of releasing the vaccine fairly, then I think we have to see some changes.
Right,
so I'm sure it's something that the Scottish Government will be... I'm not... I think there's sure that there is a review to make sure that we get on with it, because there's information being bandied about. Even in my own constituency, there's differences between urban areas and areas that are perhaps more rural and less desolate. Equally, there is clearly something there, and that has to be addressed. The health board structures, north and south of the border, are different, and therefore there's probably good reason why in Scotland you gave primacy to health boards as opposed to south of the border. But if, as I've had suggested in my own constituency, GPs could do an awful lot more, there are actually vaccines available, then I do think we have to break that logjam. I'm sure that's something that the Scottish Government will, and I'm hopeful that it will be changed.
Right. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has said that they have prioritised care home residents as one of the reasons that overall they are perhaps behind in figures. Well, they are behind, according to those figures that I've just read out. So does the government take responsibility for the priorities that it's chosen?
Well, I think they've chosen the correct priorities. I think actually ensuring those in care homes, given the tragic deaths that we have, was essential. Making sure that we deal with the over 80s, working now down towards the 70s. That is the correct way. So I think the Scottish Government acted appropriately there, and I've got no criticism whatsoever. But as per the statistics you've shown, there's clearly some divergence in terms of the pace of the rollout, and we're required to consider what that is. It cannot simply be a greater level of urbanisation in England and Wales than there is perhaps in Scotland. So it has to be some structural issue, and if that is allowing GPs or ensuring that we get other aspects as opposed to a logjam, even if health boards remain primary way of getting the vaccine supply out, then that has to be looked at. But I'm sure that the Health Secretary in Scotland will be doing that.
Right. Well, let me just show you this headline in the Daily Express, which is "What a result. British vaccines lined up until 2025. Now, on the face of it, that sounds like a good news story. But, Polly, does it fill you with some sort of fear of how long we will be living with this?
Well, I think a number of the experts have said it's going to be a bit like the flu vaccine, and we may have to have it year after year, and it may have to be slightly, the way the flu vaccine is, slightly rejigged as the virus mutates. But the chances are, I think anyone who's had the virus will at least not get very, very sick, not go to hospital, certainly not die. So I think one should be encouraged at the idea that there is a lot of it. But this competition, whether it's between the nations in the UK or whether between us and Europe, who's got most first, is very destructive and sort of irrelevant, really.
Is it irrelevant, Simon?
It's the opposite of irrelevant. This goes to the heart of how we defeat this virus as quickly as we can. Polly doesn't want it to be relevant. because the UK is, of course, outperforming most of the rest of the world in this regard. And of course this matters. It's a race every country needs to win, absolutely. And we desperately need to see this defeated in all parts of the world. But it is just flat wrong, I'm afraid, to say that speed doesn't matter here. And it's vital that we continue to deliver on what has been a world-leading programme thus far. If you look at the divergence within the UK, it is a concern. So Scotland's vaccinated 68 people for every 100 in England. And that's, that is something which worries many of us. Obviously, we're British, we all have families that span the different countries within the United Kingdom. And it's vital that for all our sakes, that we make the best speed within the UK. It's vital the UK as a whole continues to make the most swift possible progress towards full vaccination. And that's what we're intending to do.
Kenny, do you want to respond?
Oh, I mean, I agree with Polly. I mean, we live as one human race. I do think credit has to be given to the much maligned Mr. Hancock in getting the vaccine out, and obviously issues do have to be raised in Scotland. But when we have a situation where Canada apparently is heading towards having 4 times the level of vaccine required for its entire population, and we have countries in Africa where 25 people have received the vaccination, given what we started off discussing, mutations coming in from out with these borders, we will not be able to stop that happening. So we have to address this as a common, human race. So pride and I think thanks and credit has to go where it deserves in the UK for the vaccine being available. But this isn't about doing down others, because see, if we impoverish the developing world, then we'll pay the price ourselves in weeks, months and years down the line.
Robert, how do you view it? Is it important, this issue of seeing the figures, how it's progressing, how many people are being vaccinated? Is it being seen too much as a race, or is this going to actually put pressure on parts of the world to hurry up with their vaccination programmes?
Well, I think had it been the other way around and we'd been a long way behind others, we would have certainly heard a lot about that. I think the fact that the more developed countries are producing vast amounts of vaccine doesn't mean to say that we're impoverishing the rest of the world. We are going to be giving this to the rest of the world. And of course, the fact is that the highest levels at the moment are in European countries, partly because of their government policies, partly because of their intense level of interconnectedness. So I think it's fair that we should try to produce vaccines and attack the disease here, but we certainly don't want to keep these scientific successes to ourselves. And I don't think there's any intention of doing that.
All right, we'll leave it there, because if you'd like to find out more, the BBC's Ross Atkins has looked at whether these restrictions can keep out new variants of COVID-19, and that's in the news category of the iPlayer on your TV or on the app, if you want more information. Let's move on to events between members of the SNP, because Joanna Cherry, the high-profile SNP MP, was sacked from the party's front bench team in Westminster last night. This is what she said in response on Twitter. We're showing you now. Despite hard work, results and a strong reputation, I've been sacked today from the SNP front bench. This was yesterday. My constituents and fellow party members who gave me a resounding mandate in recent NEC elections should rest assured that I will continue to work hard for them. And the party's leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford, reshuffled his team, and that was what happened with Joanna Cherry. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Nick, what's going on?
Hi, Joe. There have been splits in the SNP for some time, mostly in the background, but I think they're increasingly boiling over. They're on things like independence strategy, on self-identification for trans people, on the Alex Salmond case and how he was treated by the Scottish Government. I mean, Joanna Cherry is someone who's taken different positions from the leadership, sometimes quite publicly. And I think the view of Ian Blackford and his allies was that this had got too much and that, frankly, she was not contributing to the group as they saw it. Joanna Cherry's allies will tell you that she was a key performer. You remember the Article 50 case. She was a big player in that. She's a pretty prominent MP. And there are no shortage of people in the SNP telling me today that actually they think at some point she was outshining the leadership at Westminster, and that was something to do with it. But I think it's just a sign of how significant the divisions are in the SNP group at Westminster now, that one of their key names, someone that the public know, has been sacked so unceremoniously.
Right, and Joanna Cherry, Nick, also said yesterday that she'd received a vicious threat to her personal safety, which she's referred to the police. And in response to that, Kirsty Blackman, the SNP MP and frontbencher, tweeted this: Horrified to hear that one of my colleagues received a threat last night. This is totally unacceptable, and I condemn anyone who does this. I wish the police every success in bringing this individual to justice. I am also pleased to hear that Joanna was able to get somewhere safe. Now, Joanna Cherry has responded to Kirsty Blackman with thank you for your concern, but this is what can happen when you rile up your base with lies and smears. Actions have consequences, so please think hard again before you attack a colleague on social media. # deeds, not words. That is a pretty bitter exchange. What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the trans debate, and the two are on different wings of the party when it comes to how self-recognition should work. There's no love lost between the pair either. I think at one stage they actually blocked each other, or one blocked the other on Twitter. My understanding is some of the group meetings on Zoom over the last few weeks between SNP MPs have been, pretty fraught. There have been some pretty significant arguments. But this is going to get worse rather than better over the next few weeks, because yes, you have some of these spats on Twitter, but next week Alex Salmond is due to give evidence to the Holyrood inquiry looking at how the Scottish Government handled harassment allegations against him. There are some people in the SNP, I think Kenny McCaskill is among them, who are extremely unhappy at the way that the SNP hierarchy has dealt with this. And I think, the next few weeks, although Nicola Sturgeon is riding high in the polls, although it looks like the party is going to do extremely well at the Holyrood election in May, although independence appears to now be in the lead in the polls versus the Union, there are some pretty dangerous weeks ahead for the SNP.
All right. And Nick, just to say that Kirsty Blackman has tweeted again to say, I do not, have not, and will never sanction or encourage violence or threats of violence. Politics and any other job should be a place where people feel safe. Unfortunately, we have a long, long way to go until we get to that point. Nick Hurdley, thank you very much for joining us. Now, I mean, Kenny, these events have been unfolding over the last 24 hours. What do you make of them?
Well, all parties are coalitions, they're broad churches, they have their ups and downs. We've seen it in the Conservatives. We see talent like Jeremy Hunt sitting on the back benches because at the end of the day, it's the party leadership that choose. I've been in the SNP 40 years. Over those years, I've actually been expelled and then reinstated, as indeed was Alex Salmond. So all parties go through this. To be fair to say, there's a bit of turbulence. There's no point in denying that. It's all over the papers and media in Scotland at the moment. But
it's more than a bit of turbulence.
Well, it's, the party and the independence movement will come through this. And you've also got to remember that the SNP is but one part. So when people, certainly south of the border, focus on the SNP and believe that this destabilises the campaign for independence, they forget that the SNP is but one of the political parties that support independence, and that there's a far wider movement that is of significant strength, which is why out of 20, if not 21, opinion polls have all showed independence in the lead.
Right, but
the party will get through it.
Right, but you aren't happy, are you, with what's happened to Joanna Cherry in terms of her being sacked? Why not?
Well, I think it's a big mistake. I mean, I've known Joanna now for many years, both as a lawyer and indeed as a politician. She's been outstanding in both. Why, when you want to have your best talent in the shadow cabinet, you would not have Joanna leading, especially in an area where she has performed remarkably well, both politically in the chamber and indeed in terms of the justice issue itself, bemuses me. But that is the right and entitlement of the leadership, which is, as I say, is a decision made by Keir Starmer. It's a decision made by Boris Johnson.
All right, but you say it's a massive mistake by the leadership to sack Joanna Cherry, but she has said that Westminster is increasingly irrelevant to Scotland's constitutional future and the SNP needs to radically rethink its strategy. Do you agree with that criticism of the leadership?
Yes, I think I've been arguing for a change in strategy for some considerable time. I'm delighted to have been elected to Westminster, but at the end of the day, Scotland and England are diverging. The countries, not just political parties, are going in different directions.
So what do you want them to do? What is Nicola Sturgeon not doing?
At the end of the day, I think we have to ensure that the decision on Scotland's future is decided by Scotland, that there can be no veto given to Boris Johnson or indeed Westminster. If the people of Scotland wish to hold a referendum or to have an election that decides their constitutional future, That is the democratic right of the Scottish people. We cannot have the absurdity where Boris Johnson says there cannot be a rerun of a Scottish referendum, not now, not for decades, if not generations, but he's prepared to countenance a referendum in the border in Northern Ireland every 7 years. That is undemocratic. It is unfair. The people of Scotland want change. Brexit is an unmitigated disaster.
Yeah.
And now is the time for the people of Scotland to have their own opportunity to once again become a European nation.
So the leadership's being too timid?
Well, I think the EU leadership is failing to address taking powers back from Boris Johnson, so long as, without boring your listeners about a Section 30 order,
yes,
which is the method by which the 2014 referendum was resolved amicably between Scotland, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, and it was agreed that a referendum could progress. But if a Section 30 order is not to be given, and indeed if a Section 30 order hasn't been sought, then issues arise. I happen to think that the Scottish people are in fact sovereign in this, and they should have the right to decide their own destiny, whether that's a referendum or utilising an election.
Right. Do you think Alex Salmond has been badly treated throughout this whole process and the investigation into allegations against him?
Yes, that's why I supported him and was delighted to see him both vindicated in the civil case and acquitted on all charges in the criminal case. I've known him for many years and consider him a friend. There's an investigation ongoing in the Scottish Parliament. I think it's quite correct. I do think further information is required to be made clear, but at the end of the day, Alex Salmond has been exculpated, and what went wrong, who may have done what, requires to be brought out into the open.
Right. Would you ever consider joining forces with Alex Salmond and perhaps starting a new party?
No, as far as I know, Alex Salmond has made no such suggestion. Alex stepped back from the SNP when he had his civil case to fight. He's carried this matter on to clear his name and be exonerated, as he has been, and has been successful. He's not stepped forward back into politics. My position has been to call on those in the SNP who have been upset and considered leaving over events over the weekend to remain in and fight. This is, as I say, the party that I've been in for 40 years, have indeed been expelled from and come back in.
Right.
But at the end of the day, we also have to remember that the independence movement is a broad church. It is not simply the SNP. And I've certainly called within my own party for greater hands of friendship to be put out to the wider movement, not just to those who are part
But you are encouraging people to stay within the SNP and fight from within for what you think should be the process towards independence. If you lose that battle, though, and you are ignored and sidelined, as many people would see it, because you and Joanna Cherry are probably the only SNP MPs who don't have a front bench role now, what will your alternative be?
Well, I don't believe we'll lose. The party had a national council and national elections just there at the end of November. Joanna was returned, by the barrel load, clearly as the most popular politician within the SNP. Other significant changes, well, that's a decision made by the current leadership within the parliamentary group. But the party rank and file endorsed Joanna by well over 50%, and clearly is the most popular politician within the SNP. And indeed, other significant changes took place that resulted, as I say, in a sea change. Not quite a sea change, but a significant change taking place within the powers that be in the National Executive Committee. So change is underway in the SNP.
Right, the sound is a little bit glitchy, but we're going to continue and pursue it and hope it actually goes. I just mentioned that almost every SNP MP has some sort of front bench role, by you and Joanna Cherry. Do you think that is because you're too close to Alex Salmond?
I couldn't possibly answer that. That would be a matter for others. I have to say I've got plenty to keep on my plate, whether with the Justice Committee, working with those organisations that I've built up a relationship both in Scotland and indeed across the UK. I was fortunate to have been Justice Secretary in Scotland for 7.5 years, and it's given me an awful lot of contacts. So there's work to be done, and I get on and do it. And it's for those in charge of the party group in Westminster to decide how they allocate. I just happen to think that with regard to Joanna, they've made a mistake.
Do you think she's a future leader, Joanna Cherry?
Oh, I've no doubt she's a potential future leader, absolutely. There isn't a vacancy at the present moment, but there's Joanna and there's several others who are equally talented, and exactly the same as I've served under Alex Salmond, I've served under Gordon Wilson, and you know, there will be a future leader at some stage within the SNP.
All right, it's time to move on because we're going to talk about, Robert, your book, This Sovereign Isle. We're showing everybody the front page, Britain in and out of Europe. What's the thrust of the book?
Well, there are quite a few. It's a story, it's a history. It's meant to be a short history of Brexit in the long run. But I think one of the main points that I'd make, which I think is pretty obvious, though it's not one I think that's made very often, is that the decision to leave the EU was not one taken because the British are very different from the rest of Europe. It's that we acted in a way that many people in Europe would have liked to do. Attitudes in Britain towards the EU and even in Scotland deep down are very similar to those all across Western Europe, and they're basically of discontent with the EU as an ineffective, bureaucratic and undemocratic system.
Holly?
Well, I think it's been interesting that right across Europe there's been a much more closer coming together and much less of that impulse to leave it when they've seen what's become of us, how appalling the negotiations have been, and how badly, even within this month, we're faring already. Project Fear is here already. I think there's a lot less impulse towards that across Europe. And of course, all the European countries are all very, very different, just as we're different. This idea that we are exceptional, this sovereign isle, this, every country is exceptional. The idea that they have somehow given up their sovereignty, as if the French feel any less French than we feel English, I find utterly bizarre. Of course, everybody's sovereign. Everything that really matters to people in elections is still down to each country to decide, whether it's health, education, whether it's tax, whether it's social security, whether it's the criminal justice system. Right. Every country decides those crucial things for themselves. To give away a little bit of sovereignty in exchange for pooling together things we increasingly see now are really valuable. The idea of sovereignty is a myth.
Well, let's put that. Simon, you were shaking your head while Polly was talking.
Well, I mean, Polly could not be obviously more wrong on these questions. We've seen this question play out just in the course of this month in regard to the vaccine rollout and the shambles that centralised procurement, driven by an unaccountable and ineffective commission in Brussels, has led to on the continent, as opposed to Britain, which has been able to make sensible and rapid decisions in our own national interest. But we'll see it in other guises too. So at the end of this week, Teesside will be submitting our bid for a free port, one of the new opportunities open to us in a post-Brexit world. We've applied to join the CPTPP, opening UK market access to fast-growing Pacific nations. The idea that Brexit was a mistake is flat wrong. I think what Robert's book is saying is fundamentally right, that this country has always faced globally rather than solely in a European way. It's right that we should reflect that in our actions. It's obviously crucial that we honour the democratic mandate which we've been given. And it was the Conservative Party, and really the Conservative Party alone of the major parties in British politics, who actually heeded that lesson. And that's one of the reasons why we're a majority government today. So I'm afraid I won't take any lessons from Polly on this. It's precisely that kind of taking down of the country, which people hate so much.
Polly?
Free ports were absolutely available to us while we were in Europe. Nothing to do with that. Vaccines, we could buy our own vaccines while we were in Europe, and some countries have. It's an absolute nonsense to say everything good about us is only because we're outside Europe. All of those things we can do inside Europe. Many, many untruths were told about the kinds of freedoms we had within Europe and the kinds of things that are wrong with this country that are nothing whatever to do with Europe, and the problems that remain and will disappoint people who think that everything was going to be wonderful once we left. We were going to get shed loads of money for the NHS and everything else. People are already disappointed. Already many more people are saying it was the wrong move.
Right. I mean, we've had this discussion certainly over the last 4 years, and these are the arguments that were laid out. It has actually gone on for hundreds of years, hasn't it, in one form or another, Robert?
In a way it has, but I think one has to look at the specifics. What Polly Toynbee said about Europe having, Europe, governments and to some extent peoples of Europe coming together after Brexit is, of course, because of the way that Brexit has been presented and certainly the turmoil that we went through. But I think that's a very poor basis for trying to build a future confederation. Simply the feeling that there's no alternative and that the dangers of leaving are so great. The idea that somehow every country is free to do as it likes, well, tell that to the Greeks or the Italians. It's clear that the EU does control the major issues, which are economic, financial, and indeed political. And the idea this week that one could really sing the praises of European efficiency or European solidarity, it seems to me to be rather missing the point of what's been happening over the last few days.
Yes, I mean, Kenny, has it made you look at the EU through different eyes because of what was announced? It briefly was announced and then dropped, admittedly, by the European Commission when it came to the export of vaccines.
Oh, I think that was accepted as a calamitous mistake made by the EU Commission. And I think Michael Martin, the Irish thesis, was quite clear in making certain that there was nothing that he or indeed other leaders had been supporting. But we've got to remember that, the EU has been one of these much maligned institutions. I have questions about it. Its treatment of the Greek people was disgraceful. Its failure to condemn what was being done in Catalonia was equally shameless. So it's an institution that I do think has challenges. Equally, the nonsense that was spewed out, everything from straight bananas to the bagpipes being banned, was utterly nonsensical. There are issues that have to be addressed within it, but as I say, I do think it was a mistake to leave. It's part of mythology that we seem to have had that, corporation buses, taxis, we were going to leave the EU and all was going to be fine and well. The Scottish fishing is finding it is calamitous. It is situation critical there, as it is with the vaccine rollout and what we're facing with mutations. The EU is a problem, has problems to address, but Brexit is not the solution.
Right. I mean, Robert, you talk a lot about England in your book, but what about Scotland? Is there a different relationship? Do they have a different relationship and a view towards the EU?
To some extent, yes. I think deep down not, in the sense that the EU is not any more popular in Scotland than it is in England when people are asked about what they think of what the EU does. But of course, Scottish independence depends on EU membership. It would be crazy for Scotland to become independent outside the EU, and also, of course, by leaving the UK. So I can see why Scottish nationalists are so keen on being members of the EU, because that is the only way they can really have an independence that would not be catastrophic.
Kenny?
But that's just not true. I mean, first of all, Scotland, is out of the EU because Brexit has happened. Therefore, when Scotland becomes an independent nation from the rest of the UK, it will be out with the EU and has to reapply. Yeah. That takes at least 3 to 5 years. But there are positions that can be taken, and many in the SNP are sympathetic to EFTA or EEA membership. So you get the benefits of the common market, the customs union and the single market without the political union. That's something that the Scottish people will have the opportunity to consider. So, that is a separate matter. Right. But equally, I think many in Scotland look at how Ireland has been empowered. For 800 years, the people of Ireland were dominated, indeed often colonised by their larger, more powerful neighbour. Even within recent years, we've seen a Home Secretary talking about starving the Irish people out. Ireland was never able to compete on a level playing field with the UK.
We're losing your sound.
Brexit,
I'm so sorry, Kenny. We are slightly
discussion.
losing your sound at the end of that, and we're coming up to the end of the show. Simon, your response to what you've heard?
Well, I think what we've heard from Kenny and the SNP today reflects their obsession with two things, which is fighting each other and with trying to impose a narrow nationalism within the United Kingdom, our United Kingdom, which distracts from the key business of rebuilding this country, of delivering an effective vaccination programme, moving forward together as one nation, which is what we are. There was a referendum in 2014. That was the once-in-a-generation decision, as agreed to by Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon at that time. And that's vital, that's upheld, so we can all move forward towards a shared future, which is what we should be focusing on, what this infight.
That is all we have time for, but thank you to all of my guests today. We'll be back, of course, tomorrow at the earlier time, as always on a Wednesday at 11:15. To cover Prime Minister's questions, please join me and my guests then.